Okay, let's get started. As the affirmative, we endorse the resolution as a value to be upheld, encouraging the continued model of the United Nations' New Urban Agenda as a path for sustainable development of cities across the globe. One of the most important considerations made by the New Urban Agenda, as well as the entirety of the United Nations, is that all citizens of the world are important to regard as essential, no matter their national origin. By endorsing the values of cosmopolitanism and global citizenship, we believe that prioritizing humanity over patriotism is essential. According to Nucleus in 2008, the ideology of national security served and continues to serve as a means of delineating, framing, and asserting identity. Security functions as a means not just for identifying and dealing with potential military threats, but also as a mechanism for the political constitution and cultural production of identity, and as such for the unity of political community. This reasserts and reinforces the acceptability of only certain forms of behavior, modes of being, and political subjectivities. In doing so, it steers us away from other alliances. As Nucleus describes, our world is ordered in terms of nation states, building an us versus them mentality and promoting nationalism. Instead of emphasizing our current system in which competition is the paradigm, a focus should be placed on fostering cosmopolitan consciousness in which proximity is not the most significant concern, but instead citizens understand our concerns should be global. Therefore, this debate needs to consider the agenda in terms of principle rather than implementation in order to properly address the world on a human level, instead of prioritizing nations that are more advantaged, endorsing the value of cosmopolitanism. There are three primary reasons why the resolution should be treated as a value. The first is ground. We all understand that there are rules for debate and that for the round to be fair, we need to have sufficient ground for the affirmative to cover. By treating the topic as a value, there's more room for clash between the two teams and opportunity for a fair debate. The second is education. Similar to the first, debate is an educational activity. For the round to be productive and encourage learning, we need to consider the principle of the New Urban Agenda. If we treat this topic as a strict policy, the debate will devolve into arguments about implementation and ratification rather than the agenda itself. And finally is topic integrity. Instead of getting bogged down by the details of implementation, focusing on the values of the New Urban Agenda allows for the most accurate interpretation of the resolution. The text of the resolution does not specify an actor or a reason for or a framework for implementing the New Urban Agenda, but rather encourages us to analyze it conceptually, focusing on the philosophy and design of the UN. Under this framework, there are two primary lenses in which we need to analyze the New Urban Agenda. The first is the global level. Most importantly, the New Urban Agenda is key to addressing climate change. As the agenda delineates, cities are the key arena for addressing many of the global challenges of today. However, if unplanned and poorly managed, urbanization also has the potential to exacerbate many of the problems that it claims to solve. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues facing our cities today, and if action is not taken, there's a significant threat of our world becoming unlivable, as described by Ramanathan and Zhu in 2017. Warming of such magnitudes has catastrophic human health effects. Studies focus on the direct influence of extreme events such as heat waves on public health by evaluating exposure to heat stress and hyperthermia. Climate risk can vary markedly depending on the socioeconomic status and culture of the population, and so we must take up the question of dangerous to whom. The poorest 3 billion comprises mostly subsistent farmers whose livelihood will be severely impacted, if not destroyed, within a 1 to 5 year mega drought, heat waves, or heavy floods. The bodily harms combined with climate change, forced species destruction, biodiversity loss, and threats to water and food security imply the possibility of existential threats. One of the most impactful scales in which we can address climate change is globally, which the New Urban Agenda calls for. Through a multifaceted approach to environmental sustainability, the agenda addresses both urbanized and developing areas to encourage institutional and sector-specific planning for mitigating the impacts of climate change. Additionally, maintaining the values of the New Urban Agenda is crucial to signifying overall compliance with the goals of the United Nations. Aligned with regional efforts, the agenda is a global principle guiding urban development across the globe. The agenda is obviously an important plank of the UN's entire framework because just this week, the General Assembly met in New York to renew their commitment and address its future. On Thursday, the Deputy Secretary General said the New Urban Agenda is so critical. It sets out a clear pathway for countries to develop truly sustainable cities centered on resilient economies, a clean environment, and the health, well-being, culture, and security that residents need. The New Urban Agenda offers lasting solutions to tackle the climate crisis. The UN also committed to multiple new efforts to implement the agenda, working in context-specific settings to benefit countries currently urbanizing at a rapid rate, including mobilizing the local 2030 Commission, which through some of their other committees is going to work on a localized level to implement the agenda. In conjunction with the UN's Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda fosters a sense of responsibility in addressing the world's most pressing threat. Implementation of the Paris Agreement requires economic and social transformation. On a global scale, the Paris Agreement works hand in hand with the New Urban Agenda to support countries that are less developed economically to encourage sustainable progress that will lessen the effects of climate change. The second is the individual level. The agenda espouses cosmopolitan values while also promoting the rights of all individuals, especially in its elements of social sustainability. The New Urban Agenda promotes civic engagement, engenders a sense of belonging and ownership among inhabitants, enhances social and intergenerational interaction, cultural expression, and political participation, and fosters social cohesion and pluralistic societies where the needs of all inhabitants are met, recognizing the specific needs of those in vulnerable situations. Through its approach to social and economic sustainability, the agenda holistically addresses the needs of marginalized groups and encourages the development of cities to accommodate the young, old, disabled, and disadvantaged in many ways, including by providing basic services that are responsive to the needs and rights of children, youth, and older persons, promoting capacity development initiatives to empower women and girls, and making information and communication technology accessible to the public, with special attention to children and youth, older persons and persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and local communities. Promoting well-designed networks of safe, accessible green streets and public spaces that are accessible to all and free from crime and violence, including sexual harassment and gender-based violence. The New Urban Agenda commits to providing equal opportunities and accessing public spaces, housing, basic education, services, and health facilities for all marginalized people, which provides an opportunity for sustainable development and improved quality of life. The New Urban Agenda is a widely compatible policy, addressing the needs of a variety of cultures and economic systems. Through a top-down approach, the agenda encourages fostering a sustainable society, economy, and environment, combining with the national and local governments for successful implementation. Through the framework of cosmopolitanism, the New Urban Agenda is the best global solution to our world's growing urbanization, and therefore, we urge you to side with the affirmative today. Thank you. And I'm ready for cross whenever.
Sorry. I will start in just a hot second. Thank you for your speech, by the way. Okay. First, you talk about climate change. Do you think we have the means and the status quo to combat climate change through the New Urban Agenda?
By the means, like, what specifically do you mean?
Like, do you think we have like the technology and that kind of things that are sufficient to combat climate change exclusively through the New Urban Agenda?
Right. So what the New Urban Agenda focuses on, it focuses on a lot of, so not only these sustainable 3 prongs, but it also focuses a lot on innovation and the role of innovation specifically in the sector of climate to better further working to combat warming and climate change as a whole. And so I think through the lens of the New Urban Agenda and through this platform and through the UN's resources that they're implementing on this localized level, we do have a very strong potential to mitigate climate change significantly.
Okay. Thank you. So you talked about the United Nations just meeting in the past week. What was different about this meeting than the meeting that they happened to have in 2016 and the meeting that they had before that, all the previous meetings about the New Urban Agenda?
Right. So I always forget this, that 2016 was like 6 years ago. Because it seems like it was very recently that the agenda was implemented, but it actually was a significant amount of time. And what they did in this meeting was not only renew their commitment, but they made concrete claims and concrete implementations to better get the agenda like rolled out. And they deployed this commission to go on a localized level. And
okay. Yeah. Sorry, I just have a lot of questions, but thank you.
Good.
Next, you mentioned the Paris Agreement and how it was important that there was like the sort of spillover effect and affecting other agreements. Are you aware that we're in like a global democratic breakdown where democratic countries are essentially backsliding? So like Donald Trump, for example, left the Paris Agreement. So wouldn't you agree that promoting democracy and preventing far-right leaders such as do things like that is a net benefit and should be a priority?
Right. So what this argument is mostly saying is that it's really crucial to the United Nations credibility and to like their credibility as an institution, which will help with democratic promotion, to maintain their agenda and like maintain a straightforward path. Because if they were to have this meeting 2 days ago and then turn around and say, oh, just kidding, we changed our mind, that would have like institutional problems. Okay. That would affect a lot of countries.
So you mentioned marginalized groups. Would you say that the promotion of equity and equality for all marginalized groups is a core of this debate?
Yeah.
Okay, so are you aware that the New Urban Agenda explicitly does not speak about the LGBTQ community because of backlash that happened from Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran?
I mean, I know that, the agenda doesn't like specifically, I know it doesn't mention them by name, but it also doesn't really mention marginalized groups except in terms of age and gender.
So all of the benefits that you claim you receive from other marginalized groups, we don't get anyway, but on top of that, there is the explicit exclusion of the LGBTQ community?
No, I don't believe that there's an explicit like exclusion of any marginalized group. I believe what they're saying is like marginalized groups includes all people who are marginalized, even if they don't delineate every single one of them, because we live in kind of a not great world sometimes, and there are a lot of different marginalized communities.
Thank you. We actually have a card about the explicit exclusion, but we'll get to that later because I have some more questions.
You guys can read that in a speech.
How many people live in rural areas?
I believe it's 45% of the world right now.
So how does the new urban agenda do anything to create sustainable development in rural areas?
Right. So as the card about climate change mentions, climate change is like the most existential threat to our entire planet. And people who live in rural areas are often going to be the ones that are experiencing this first, because they live in the areas that are going to be most severely impacted by climate change first. And so we would argue that any benefit that we can bring to ending the effects of climate change or mitigating the effects of climate change would have a significant spillover benefit to them, as well as building infrastructure has a national level and global level benefit to all people of a nation or country or the world. And so we would argue that the systems put into place by the new urban agenda has spillover effects for everyone.
Okay, thank you. That's time.
Okay.
Am I audible? Okay, awesome. I'll be started on my next word. Just to introduce myself really briefly, my name is Delphine, debater from Miami. I'll be speaking first for the negation. Zero poverty, zero hunger, reduced inequalities. These are a few of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. These goals encapsulate a vision of a society that protects human rights for every global citizen, not just the urban elite. Rather than build cities on a broken system, we must rebuild broken systems to build better communities of all kinds. This is why Iman and I proudly negate today's resolution. We offer the following framework. When we weigh impacts in today's round, we should center our impact analysis on which side most quickly and efficiently achieves sustainable development defined by the UN Sustainable Development Goals for all individuals. We want to emphasize that priority is at the heart of this debate. Cambridge Dictionary defines priority as something that you do or deal with first because it's more important and urgent than other things. The affirmative must prove that the new urban agenda is not only important, but its implementation must be urgent and prioritized above all other global policy initiatives and sustainable development efforts. In light of violent global conflict, the proliferation of authoritarian and far-right governments, and a global pandemic that has accelerated poverty and inequality worldwide, can we really say building better cities should be our #1 priority in 2022? Iman and I want to frame the Sustainable Development Goals as the top priority. However, the new urban agenda should not be a priority because it is at best a distraction from the SDGs and at worst an impediment towards them. Instead, you should weigh the team that best achieves the priority of sustainable development. Our case slogan is you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Cities are nothing more than a symptom of the broken and diseased societies they're built in. And failing cities are symptomatic of a society riddled by structural issues that need to be fixed first. We offer 2 key observations about why the new urban agenda should not be a sustainable development priority. First, the NUA is tone deaf and impractical. And second, we should prioritize people and the planet, not cities. Observation 1, the new urban agenda is tone deaf and impractical. Firstly, it ignores that societies are not just comprised of cities. It advocates for one-size-fits-all approach to sustainability. Although the affirmative defense is focused on cities by saying it's 55% of the population, this ignores over 3 billion people residing in rural areas who are arguably the greatest victims of sustainability and human rights issues. The most unsustainable industries are centered in rural areas like mining, forestry, fishing, agriculture, and they notoriously infringe on the human rights of its workers. To leave rural areas behind not only is a myopic approach to sustainability, but fails on sustainable development goal number 12, responsible consumption and production, number 13, climate action, and also allows human rights abuses to run unchecked, violating goal number 1, no poverty, 3, good health and well-being, and 10, reduce inequalities. Secondly, the new urban agenda does not call for corporate sustainability reforms, a huge oversight that makes mitigating the climate crisis impossible. Josh Axelrod writes for the National Resource Defense Council in 2019 that 100 energy companies have been responsible for 71% of all industrial emissions since human-driven climate change began. And it's not just their energy sector. The top 15 US food and beverage companies generate nearly 630 million metric tons of greenhouse gases every year. Multinational corporations create the most pollution and profit the most off of unsustainable business practices, yet the new urban agenda does not target corporate stakeholders, nor does it include corporate social responsibility as one of its policy goals. Third, the new urban agenda doesn't challenge neocolonialism and neoliberalism. Without undermining those structures, inequality increases because development in the global south depends on unsustainable industries creating economic growth in lesser developed countries through exploitation of their impoverished workforce. We call this the made in China to made in Bangladesh pipeline. First, the West exports its most pollution-creating industries, worsening exploitation, air quality, and sustainability in the global south, and generates economic activity that develops these countries until they can export those industries as well. This is the reason our clothes used to say made in China, and now they say made in Bangladesh. China became wealthier by letting the West exploit its workforce in sweatshops, and now they can reproduce colonialism and exploit other poor countries, creating a vicious cycle. Finally, the narrow focus on urbanization in a new urban agenda forces a trade-off between different SDGs, preventing achievement of all 17 of them and worsening climate change. Fred Caproti, a researcher in the Department of Geography at the University of Exeter, found in 2017 that potential trade-offs among efforts to reach different sustainable development goals need to be taken into account by all those who strive to implement the NUA. Many of the trade-offs can be explained by current unsustainable growth paradigm, which gives priority to economic growth as a way to generate human welfare at the expense of the environment, which Iman will go into later. Observation 2, we need to prioritize people and the planet, not cities. We started the speech by saying that achieving sustainable development goals are urgent, and we only have 7.5 years left until 2030. We need to solve the SDGs on a faster and more efficient timeline. The new urban agenda falls short of its own vision of eliminating the 3 major obstacles for sustainable development worldwide, which in the document itself it says are the persistence of multiple forms of poverty, growing inequalities, and environmental degradation. As we stated in the previous observation, the new urban agenda is a misguided blueprint to achieve these 3 major obstacles. Instead, we advocate for the following 3 initiatives to be prioritized above the new urban agenda. First, promoting democracy. Second, accelerating implementation and innovation of green tech with all hands on deck approach to innovation. And third, enforcing global corporate sustainability reforms to ensure that they are mitigating and holding multinational corporations responsible for mass pollution, carbon emissions, and unethical labor practices. By promoting democracy, we're going to focus on having, free and fair elections, by eliminating voter suppression, by working hand in hand with different UN agencies focus on promoting democracy, overseeing elections, and overseeing policies to ensure we have less democratic breakdown that we do in the status quo. Because not only do we see countries that are authoritarian and far right flourishing, we also see countries that were previously democratic sliding back into less democratic forms of government, which is hurting everyone and hurting our fight for sustainability. I began this case by telling you that you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. Promoting democracy, accelerating implementation and innovation of green tech, and global enforcement of corporate sustainability reforms fix the structural and systemic issues underlying the symptoms that create the cities the new urban agenda wants to fix. For all these reasons and more, Iman and I proudly negate. I'm ready for cross-sex whenever y'all are.
Awesome. Me too. Starting time now. Okay, so let's just start at the end and then work our way back to the beginning. So is this your 3 alternatives? Are we treating this as a counter plan, or how do you?
Right, so we're advocating for basically not necessarily a counter advocacy, but for a sequential approach that both basically these are the systemic issues, and this is stated in the new urban agenda itself, that persistence of multiple forms of poverty, growing inequalities, and environmental degradation are the 3 major obstacles for sustainable development.
So what is their function in our round today? Why are they voters independently? Are we treating them as conditional counter plans? Are we treating them how are we? Can we just get some kind of clarification of a title kind of?
Yeah, so given that this is a civic debate format, I don't necessarily subscribe to a policy debate framework or that debate jargon. I think we're just saying, in plain English, anybody can understand. We believe that these 3 things need to be accomplished before you get any of the goals achieved in the new urban agenda, because the new urban agenda will fail if it's taken in the current framework of democratic backslide, of corporate unsustainability, lack of accountability. We think we need to do those first. And I think the keyword here is priority. These things should be prioritized above the new urban agenda.
So a vote for the negative team would be a vote for doing these 3 things and then doing the new urban agenda. Oh,
Sorry,
can't.
I guess I got muted really quick. I'm so sorry about that.
You're good.
No, we said that a vote for the new urban agenda a vote for the negative is basically voting for doing these three things instead of the new urban agenda. If you believe the new urban agenda is good, then we need to do these three things first. But we also show you why the new urban agenda isn't really effective in the status quo. So we truly believe that voting for the negative, if you think the new urban agenda is good, is the only way to get to the new urban agenda. And if you don't think it's good, which we don't think is necessarily a good thing, then you shouldn't vote for the new urban agenda. Like otherwise, it creates a lot of harm.
Okay, thank you. Now let's circle backwards a little bit more to like the neoliberalism, neocolonialism argument. So the democratic values that y'all are trying to promote across the world, would those be like Western democratic values, or would they be like UN member state democratic values? Like, what kind of democratic values are y'all trying to
Right. So these are democratic.
on?
So the democratic values. So obviously, as you know, democracy is one of the pillars of the United Nations and like coming to a consensus. Specifically, we're focusing mostly on democratic breakdown. So it's not necessarily going to go into Saudi Arabia, dismantle the monarchy. Like that's just not, an effective plan. But specifically looking at the places that are democratic in the status quo or were democratic in the status quo, US, France, UK, that are going through a democratic breakdown. Their leaders are not necessarily as democratic as they used to be, and ensuring that we reinstate democracy in these countries, because these are people who have a lot of control over sustainability. When Donald Trump was elected, he withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. So having sustainable leaders at the forefront is incredibly crucial to achieving any sustainable development goals.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of sustainable development goals, let's go to those with like the time that we have left. So you mentioned the 4, 1, 12, 13, and 10. So the relationship between the sustainable development goals and the new urban agenda, can you just like dive into that a little bit more? Like, what's the difference between the two? Why should we prefer one set of goals over the other? Like,
absolutely.
Is it true that like the new urban agenda was passed and signed by the UN like less than a year after the SDGs were? And so isn't it true that a lot of the same concepts were just materialized in the new urban agenda?
Right, exactly. And that's our whole point. The UN Habitat themselves say that the new urban agenda is supposed to be an accelerator of all 17 sustainable development goals, yet we clearly show you that there is an inherent trade-off in pursuing the new urban agenda and basically cannibalizing some of the sustainable development goals, and it doesn't actually achieve most of them. So
awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. And then just as brief off time roadmap, we're just going to be going down the next side of the flow. Is anyone not ready? Perfect. All right. Starting off with this idea of framework, they tell you that the framework for today's round should be whichever side can more like quickly achieve sustainability. You should prefer the AF framework in today's round because it's more comprehensive. We tell you that you need to be looking through this through more like a frame of mind, and that's the cosmopolitan frame of mind. We should be worried about this because it's more in line with like what the UN generally stands for, and that's that we need to be looking at the world as like a global society. We don't need to be worried about like these nationalistic viewpoints, which the NAG actually brings up. They tell you that nationalism is like bad and harmful under their like alt. On like how we should be prioritizing democracy. So obviously they believe that we need to be getting away from this nationalist mindset, and the frame of cosmopolitanism allows us to do that. You should prioritize it because it's more broad and it is a good overview for today's round. So prioritize that framework going through today's round. They then go on to talk about how like under like their framework, how SDGs should be a priority. I have two responses. Like first, this is kind of outside the scope of like the NUA. They say, don't look at the NUA. We need to be looking at whatever side can best like achieve these SDG priorities, which leads me to a second attack, which is the fact that this is an unfair burden on the AF. Like the resolution has the AF uphold the new urban agenda. So we need to be considering the new urban agenda. Like we can talk about sustainable development goals, but that's not the only thing we should be talking about. So the fact that that's built into their framework, that should be the priority of today's round is completely an unfair burden, and also takes us outside like the scope of the debate. We don't want to get away from the resolution, which is like what prioritizing SDGs is doing. Under the first contention, they talk about how it's impractical and this really and tone deaf, and this really revolves around the fact that around like it ignores like rural people. They tell you that like 45% of people live in like rural areas, and like the new urban agenda like completely ignores them. I have several responses. First, this was brought up for Cross, but it is an urban agenda. The neg presents a completely unfair burden of the AF by asking us to solve in rural areas when the agenda wasn't written with rural areas as a priority. If it was written as like the new global agenda, then that would be a different debate. But because the agenda agenda specifies that it is a new urban agenda, this is completely an unfair burden to ask us to solve in rural places. Furthermore, they can't claim that like because it doesn't work in rural places, it doesn't work. That's a huge leap. It's not necessarily meant to work in rural places. But even if you don't buy that, the new urban agenda is becoming more aware of relevance of rural areas. When the UN met on Thursday of this week, they affirmed that urbanization affects all human settlements and the policy must go beyond urban versus rural discourse to focus rather on urban-rural interlinkages, supply chains, and agricultural development that are paramount to issues of food security. This reflects that the urban agenda is indeed cognizant of these rural issues, which they tell you it's not. But on Thursday, the UN reaffirmed that it is indeed cognizant of these issues, that rural areas are built like into solvency here. Thirdly, AF still solves. Mitigating climate change in urban areas has positive spillover effects in rural areas as well. This was brought up during cross-examination. The NUA won't just reduce carbon emissions in urban areas, but globally. So if we're reducing carbon emissions, if we're becoming more sustainable, if we're becoming more climate resilient, which is what the new urban agenda does, we're not only going to see those effects in urban areas, but we're going to see them in rural areas as well. You can't just limit like carbon emissions to New York City, you reduce global carbon emissions. So don't like buy into this fact that it's completely ignoring these rural people and leaving them out. It's not. But even if you don't buy that, Judge, look to time frame. Both sides agree that climate change is a pressing issue with existential threats. Thus, a focus on like urban areas, which tend to sometimes be coastal areas or where there's a higher density of population, it's justified that these areas will, because these areas will be like affected first and affected more greatly by climate change. So if you're voting on time frame, you're voting for the AF ballot. They then go on to talk about colonization here, and then they move on to trade-offs between SDGs and the new urban agenda. Don't buy into this point. Like the new urban agenda, as was brought up during cross, is based off of SDGs. It's often a repetition. The difference is, Judge, while it's the same concepts, it has an actual implementation and finance plan. So if you're preferring one over the other, you should be preferring the new urban agenda over SDGs, because while it has the same concepts, it actually gives governments at all levels a way to implement these concepts and track and monitor them, which means you should be preferring the new urban agenda. They then go to talk on about like priority of people. They then take this back to like an issue of a climate change, but here, Judge, like AF is the only side that can actually solve for climate change. So if you're voting on climate change, if you're voting on this point, this argument actually like turns AF. That means that you're going to be like, if you're voting on this argument, you're voting for the affirmative, because the new urban agenda gives us the best shot at solving climate change. Again, take that back to cross-examination. We talk about how the new urban agenda upholds the Paris Climate Agreement and other agreements, as well as the UN legitimacy, which will be super helpful in solving for climate change, and also combines like the global tools that we currently have to fight climate change. So if you're voting on climate change, vote for the affirmative, because we have the best chance at actually solving for this. Now on to the alternative. They talk about three things: prioritizing democracy, green tech, and corporate accountability. First, Judge, they contradict themselves. They tell you that colonialism is bad and that it leads to these horrendous effects, but then they turn around and tell you in the alt that we should be spreading democracy. Colonialism is predicated on the idea that a country or system is seeing itself as superior and then forcing its ways and norms on other countries. That's exactly what they're doing under the democracy point. They're saying democracy is best. Every country should be a democracy. Don't let them have it both ways, Judge. It's either colonialism is bad or we should, in essence, be colonizing. One way or the other, they don't get access to both their impacts and the alt. But two, if you don't buy this, if you don't buy the alt perm, do the plan and the mutually non-exclusive parts of the alternative, as most of the alternative is not mutually exclusive. It can be done in junction with the affirmative. This leaves them in a double bind. The alternative is so weak that it combined plan in a permutation, then it fails, then it will never be able to overcome all the obstacles in the status quo. If the alternative is strong enough to overcome all the obstacles, then it can be combined with the plan. Either way, the ballot flows AF. I now stand open for cross.
Thanks for that great speech. Are you ready for cross?
I am, yes.
Okay, I'll be starting my timer on my next word.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start with the unfair burden because of the sustainable development goals. So how do you define sustainable development?
So you're actually the one who brought up like sustainable development goals, like as a priority. And when you bring them up, you're talking about like you explicitly said in your
Right, that's not sorry. I'm so sorry to cut you off, but I just want to like get through the questions. I just want to specifically understand how the affirmative defines sustainable development.
Sorry, just to clarify, are you asking me to define a sustainable development or sustainable development goals? Because those are going to
Yes. So obviously the topic you're defending is that it should be a sustainable development priority. So we just want to understand how you guys define sustainable development.
Sure, no problem. So sustainable development is meeting like the needs of now, like without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet
Right.
their
So
as
okay.
defined
So
in the
wouldn't you agree that the sustainable development goals are a mechanism by which sustainable development is quantified?
Sure.
Okay, so why wouldn't it be fair for you guys to defend the sustainable development goals if you have to defend a sustainable development priority?
Well, because sustainable development goals are something like different. Like it's its own document. It's its
How
own
exactly is it different? Given that the
Just let me
UN
finish.
defines sustainable development, the UN created the new urban agenda, and the UN created the sustainable development goals. So where exactly is
Sure.
it? Like where's the issue here?
If you'd let me finish, I was getting to that point. So when we're talking about sustainable development goals, we're not just talking about like goals in general that like meet the needs of now without like compromising the needs of the future generation to be able to meet their needs. When we're talking about sustainable goals, we're talking about a document like you outline. You're like number 1, number 10, number 13. So those are like specific goals that are supposed to have like some kind of like measuring and evaluation strategy. So when
Okay.
you're talking about making sustainable development goals as a priority, that's unfair because then it gets outside the scope of like the new urban agenda. I completely agree. We're
Thank you.
talking about sustainable
Thank you
development.
so much. Sorry, we're just like cutting close on time. We
Yeah,
only have
go-
2 minutes left.
for
I
it.
really appreciate it, but we don't agree. We'll get on that later. So moving on. So could you please like restate your definition of priority?
We didn't give a definition of priority.
Okay, so do you not have a definition for priority?
I mean, I would say like to prioritize something is to put emphasis on it, maybe more so than something else.
Right. So wouldn't you agree that priority indicates urgency?
I would, yes.
Okay, so it needs to be done before everything else.
While it does like indicate urgency, it doesn't indicate like singularity. You're trying to say we can only have like one priority, while I would like completely disagree with that
And
fact.
wouldn't you agree that even if it doesn't indicate singularity, it does indicate sequentialism?
No.
How so?
I mean, like you can prioritize more than one thing at once. Like,
Right, but if I want to, okay, if I prioritize driving my car today, wouldn't finding
okay,
my
first of all, that is completely a semantical argument and completely unfair. Climate change, prioritizing things like climate change inequality, that's not as simple as like driving your car or choosing between this or
right?
that.
I mean, the
That
point that
gets
I'm trying
the
to
realm of like
illustrate
an
is that
either
you have
or
to do.
fallacy.
Sorry, the point that I'm trying to illustrate is that you have to do some things first before getting to the next thing. So if I want to drive my car, don't I have to find my keys? Yes or no?
That's not complete. That's not
Yes
relevant
or no,
to what we're
please.
talking about. Climate, when you're thinking about climate change, you're not going to be like, yes, some things will occur in sequential order, but on different steps, you're going to be doing a multitude of different things.
Okay,
especially at a global
I'll
level.
cap on this. I'm so sorry. We just don't have a lot of time left. So aren't you aware that multinational corporations are the #1 drivers of pollution and climate change?
Corporation, sorry, just to clarify.
Multinational corporations. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, no?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Okay. So
yes.
how does the affirmative tackle the disproportionate impacts of corporations on climate change?
That's time, but is it all right if I go ahead and answer?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. So A, like the new urban agenda is going to be like working with these corporations. That's part of the funding structure. Like B, there are international laws that like make sure that corporations like are like operating by the rules. And like C, there's a ton of environmental regulations that solve for any of the impacts that you bring up. And furthermore, like the credibility of the UN is at stake here. Like they have to stick to the new urban agenda, like to maintain their legitimacy, which is brought up in an earlier cross-examination.
Thank you. That's time.
You cannot fix the symptoms symptoms, you must cure the disease. Broken cities are symptoms of broken systems. The New Urban Agenda works within these broken systems. Maria Kaika in 2017 states in reference to the New Urban Agenda that this old framework vaccinates citizens and environments so that they can take larger doses of inequality and degradation in the future. It mediates the effects of global socio-environmental inequality, but does little towards alleviating it. The topic statement tells you that the negative needs to show you why the New Urban Agenda is undesirable in the status quo and why it cannot coexist with a negative world. We explain that it's undesirable because of the trade-offs between the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. And second, that our plan is competitive because the promotion of democracy, the promotion of green tech innovation, and the promotion of corporate sustainability are prerequisites. So the trade-off argument, to re-clarify, the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of goals, such as zero hunger, zero poverty, and are goals that we believe are sustainable development priorities that we want to achieve. The New Urban Agenda was a vehicle in an attempt to mechanize those goals, and we say that that doesn't happen. We were told in the last cross-examination question that the credibility of the United Nations is at stake, which is why we think it's incredibly ironic that the United Nations wants to enact the New Urban Agenda, because there is a trade-off. The International Journal of Urban Sustainable Development says that in efforts to achieve one sustainable target, which the New Urban Agenda does, Sustainable Development Goal 11, it can also lead to trade-offs in achieving other targets. For example, actions to meet a need for increased housing can lead to conversion of farmland and green areas, affecting the livelihood of farmers at the urban-rural interface, disturbing ecosystems through convergence of local ecosystem and pushing food production further away from consumers. So we proved to you that the New Urban Agenda does not adequately solve or work towards the Sustainable Development Goals through the two observations. First, that the New Urban Agenda is tone deaf and impractical. We are told that because the New Urban Agenda resolves for urban areas, that it's an unfair burden to look at rural areas. But we say that by ignoring rural areas, you are actually inflicting harm on these people, because societies are not just cities. Rural areas exist too. The New Urban Agenda sacrifices the welfare of rural communities at the expense of sustainable development. Approximately 3 billion people live in rural areas. The Encyclopedia of World Problems and Human Potential states that unsustainable rural development and leaving behind rural areas, in fact, aggravates 1. Resource depletion, 2. The absorption of rural communities, 3. Indiscriminate economic development, 4. The destruction of rural subsistence economy, and 5. The degradation of agricultural land by cash crops. So ignoring through this focus on urbanization, rural areas are often at the expense of urban areas. Infrastructure building often uproots rural areas. So by not accounting for these, not only do you leave behind 3 billion people, but you threaten sustainable development for all of us. This can also affect the environmental and climate benefits that we supposedly get. Methane emissions happen from cattle and mining, all these things that happen in rural areas which are left completely untouched. Next, the ignoring purposely of the LGBTQ community is a net harm. Francesca Perry in Quito states that Canada, backed by the EU, the United States and Mexico, as well as Argentina and Colombia, had for months pushed for the inclusion of the recognition of the LGBTQ people in a list of vulnerable groups in the New Urban Agenda who should not be discriminated against. But during negotiations of the agenda, a group of up to 17 countries led by Belarus, including Russia, Egypt, Qatar, etc., blocked the inclusion of LGBTQ rights in the agenda, requesting their removal from a list of groups from the document. So not only is the New Urban Agenda ignoring and inciting harm upon these groups, but we think that the lack of inclusion means that it isn't even a worthwhile attempt at mechanization. Next, the New Urban Agenda uses a neo-colonial neoliberal framework, explaining to you that the one-size-fits-all notion is misguided. Delphine also explains that there's a tone-deaf approach to a global north versus global south implementation. One of the goals of the NUA is to transition from the informal economy to the formal economy. In this transition, you get workers in the global south often subjugated to exploitation and unethical working conditions and more. The New Urban Agenda also fails to account for corporate sustainability, which is legally binding. Next, in our observation 2, and when we protect people and planet, not the cities, we have this idea that democracy, promotion, green technology, and corporate sustainability are prerequisite. Why? Democracy. Because democracy is at the core of a successful global system. Global democratic breakdown and recession is the greatest obstacles to securing human rights, eliminating poverty and inequality, passing environmentally friendly policies. This looks like the promotion of free and fair elections and tackling voter suppression in rural areas. We have democratic backslide because of things like voter suppression, leaving out rural populations. Leaving these rural populations behind leads to rural resentment, and you get the election of far-right people and this promotion of democratic backside. This looks like countries like England voting for Brexit and preventing, and countries like France almost voting for Marine Le Pen. So not only can we solve for democratic harms by prioritizing democracy and preventing democratic backslide, we can resolve environmental degradation by assuring the support of leaders more likely to prioritize the protection of the environment. So why green tech? Because Kimberly Henderson writes that the world does not yet have all the technologies to solve the net zero equation. So any of the benefits or the supposed innovation that you get on the new urban agenda cannot exist because that technology doesn't exist yet. So the promotion of green technology as a prerequisite to a potential new urban agenda is what should be prioritized first, because that innovation can then reduce carbon emissions, offer a greener energy source, and more. Next, why corporate sustainability? Because this subverts any issues of neocolonialism or neoliberal agendas. Multinational corporations and other stakeholders need to be held legally accountable for their disproportionate environmental impacts and perpetuating inequity. Holding them as stakeholders isn't enough. We need to hold them accountable for the actions that they do so that they no longer have the ability to find loopholes in blanket government policies, such as the new urban agenda, because nearly 2/3 of major industrial greenhouse gas emissions come from just 90 companies around the world, which either emitted carbon themselves or supplied carbon, which we believe, what the negative case tells you, you cannot fix the symptoms, you must cure the disease. By telling you why we think the new urban agenda and the status quo is harmful, we show you that the new urban agenda and the affirmative world is not something that should be promoted. But also we offer a counter advocacy by showing you that the prioritization of implementation of green tech, promoting democracy and enforcement of corporate sustainabilities are paramount, and which is why Delphine and I are proud to negate.
All right, are you ready for cross-X?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so is every marginalized group delineated in the new urban agenda? Like, does it specifically say like people of the Muslim religion or like Jewish groups?
Well, it attempts to advocate, but it does so in like a poor attempt. So like in its attempt to include or advocate for indigenous communities, for example, we think it comes at the expense of others, and that its specific advocacy for the exclusion of the LGBTQ community is a net harm and something that we don't think should be considered a blueprint.
Okay, but more generally, does it not rely to marginalized groups as like marginalized groups or marginalized people, like incorporating all people who can be marginalized?
Potentially, but we think because it was specifically advocated for the exclusion of the LGBTQ community, that they are not encapsulated within this marginalized community protection.
Okay, thank you. So then, yeah, sorry, if we can just like move to the alternative real quick. So you talk about like green tech and how we like need more of this technology. Like, are you saying that like it's inherent to the new urban agenda, like that if this technology becomes available, like suddenly it's not going to be incorporated to the new urban agenda?
Oh, well, no, we're just saying that in terms of reference of the motion, it says that the new urban agenda should be a sustainable development priority. And we say that the innovation of green tech is a prerequisite to that priority, which is why it should be prioritized over the new urban agenda. It doesn't exist. And that innovation needs to happen first before you can get close to what the new urban agenda wants.
Okay, well, but like if the tech doesn't exist now, like how could we incorporate it into the urban agenda now? Like you're saying, like,
well, that's what we're saying. We're saying you can't, which is why we need to prioritize, because any of the benefits that you say you might get from potential whatever doesn't exist.
Okay, but could you not do it at the same time, especially when you bring up this huge argument of like, time frame? Like if we have to act now, why just not start with the urban agenda now, and then as the tech progresses, incorporate that into the new urban agenda?
No, because I already explained to you the harms of the trade-off, and when you use the mechanization of the new urban agenda through Sustainable Development Goal 11, the harms and the trade-offs that happen to rural populations, plus the exclusion of the LGBTQ community, how the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. So we think that the new urban agenda is not compatible, and that the prioritization of democracy, innovation of green tech, and legally binding corporate sustainability have to come first before you can even do something close to a new urban agenda.
Okay, but like just say that we did the new urban agenda, like in the AF world, right? Like could you not include like all of the things that you bring up in the alternative, like as they become available, like the green tech tools, when they're suddenly available, we could incorporate them?
No, because it would fail. You can't have the implementation of, you know, corporate of like climate change policies without having a democratic leader that wants to implement climate change policies. We think that these things all happen first, and you can't have those things without having our promotion first. Like corporate sustainability, you can't then advocate for climate change things when you're not holding corporations accountable. You can't then have like the advocacy for climate change when you're not having the innovation of green tech first. You can't have the advocacy for all the other things you're doing without democracy. You know, you could have a great environmentally friendly city, but congratulations, because of a lack of democracy and democratic backsliding, your city's bombed, and then there's no city. So
okay, going off of that democracy point, like if you're dependent on leaders who like support like climate change, like sustainable development goals, right? Like you can have leaders like in a democracy who don't support those goals, can you not?
Potentially, but through the promotion of democratic.
Okay, but so then if that's the case, sorry,
Wait,
I could do that. Sorry, just time constraint. If that's the case, like, how can you ensure that like democracy is actually going to solve for this if you can have a leader who doesn't support these goals in a democracy?
Minimization of that potential occurring. So what happens is rural resentment creates this far right, like extremist democratic breakdown. So for example, in England, the reason that Brexit happened was because there was rural resentment from people that have been left behind through city focused policies, which is why Brexit was enacted in the first place. People then had this resentment. So when you have policies which are geared against rural populations, we think that then it's necessary to have promotion that prevents democratic breakdown to then prevent and create like sustainability and other things in the future.
Thank you.
We have 2 minutes of prep, right? But it's going to be mostly like overview stuff. Is anybody not ready? Cool. So at the end of the day, the biggest impact in this debate is who can better solve and address for the impacts of climate change. And I'm here to prove to you why that's the affirmative and why that's under the framework of the new urban agenda. So let's start on the negative case flow with the argument about like fixing the symptoms and not curing the disease. Just all across, what we're trying to do is through the new urban agenda, it is going to not only work to improve cities that are already developed, but also work in cities that are currently urbanizing to make them better for everyone living in the entire area. So not only people who are living in the urban area, but also people who are living in the rural areas. Like Ellie mentioned, just 2 days ago, the UN refined what they're doing with the new urban agenda, and they made it better to address the concerns of people in rural areas. And so their whole impracticality and their whole argument about people who are not being incorporated is just completely flowing to the aft, because the UN understands that this is an issue and we are working to address it. And also the spillover effects of the new urban agenda will benefit them. Now onto the prioritizing people argument. And just like kind of this alternative as a whole, it's not really completely fair that they never really explain any kind of actor, any kind of mechanism, any kind of funding. They just suggest, which I understand that this is a public style of debate, but as the affirmative, we have to endorse the actor of the United Nations through the funding mechanisms that are designed to implement the new urban agenda. That's our burden, and they don't have the same kind of burden, and that's not really fair. And not only that, but these completely contrast with a lot of their own points, especially their arguments about spreading neoliberalism and neocolonial values, because as Ellie mentioned earlier, what we're going to see is if they're trying to do this, it's just going to continue this kind of spread. because by trying to enforce these democratic values onto other countries that might not currently have them, they're just trying to spread an ideology that they don't have. And that is the exact concept of colonialism. So they don't really have any offense in this sense, because not only is it completely generic and vague, but it also is not really going to solve for anything, because this green technology can be incorporated under the new urban agenda anyways. And there's also corporate accountability under the new urban agenda, because as Ellie mentioned, multinational corporations are incorporated in the funding mechanism of the new urban agenda by the United Nations, so that there is a system of accountability. So now let's go on to the AF. What you're going to see on the AF on the flow is mostly just work done by Ellie and I, because there hasn't really been anything done to address it at all. They conceded our framework of cosmopolitanism. They didn't really ever address that. So what you're going to do is you're going to frame this debate as the idea of we are all global citizens working to try to solve the issue of climate change, and what is the best way to do that. And what we're arguing to you is that's not through democracy, but that's through this national global consciousness and this global citizenship that we're trying to endorse as the affirmative. So if you go to the first level, we all agree that climate change is an existential threat that had gone conceded throughout the entire debate. However, they never ever really addressed this meeting that occurred on Thursday. And that is the key tipping point as to why you need to be voting for the affirmative today, because not only does it signify the commitment that the United Nations has, but also the recognition of the sheer magnitude and the pressing nature of this issue. Because what we're seeing is the United Nations met these couple days ago to address not only that urbanization is continuing to grow and that the projections include that more people are going to be living in urban areas in the next few decades, but also what you're going to see is that the United Nations addresses this as part of their holistic platform. This is another point that was completely conceded by the negative team, that the UN maintaining integrity on all of their platforms across the board and all of these different planks that they have to address global issues is crucial. If they just simply step back and say, we're no longer doing the new urban agenda 2 days after they just met to re-signify their commitment to it, what you're going to see is this kind of falling apart of all of their agreements. So the Paris Agreement will no longer have nearly as much credibility. The sustainable development goals that the negative team really enjoys talking about will also not have as much credibility, because the United Nations will show that they don't actually have this kind of commitment. And under this global citizen framework, what we need to do is prioritize the globe. Instead of prioritizing just democracies, what we're doing is prioritizing every single person living anywhere in the world. And so this is why we want to endorse this kind of framework and this kind of platform, because it is so localized and based on specific levels. As we mentioned in this meeting, they also decided that there are going to be specific commissions sent out on the local level to work with local and national governments to better implement the new urban agenda. This means that their commitment is significant and that they're going to actually be taking concrete action in the next few months and the next few years to work to mitigate the effects of climate change that we all see are so serious and severe. And finally, on the individual level, this also went completely unaddressed really by the negative team, except on their own case. But what we're seeing is that there are these programs being implemented socially through the new urban agenda that are going to address a lot of the social problems that we see in cities that cause isolation and accessibility issues, including for marginalized communities. Just because the new urban agenda doesn't mention every single marginalized community doesn't mean that they're not all going to be included and encompassed when it's rolled out locally. Just because there was backlash on the international level doesn't mean that the local level will not have the same kind of implementation, just because there is this policy put into place and there are these oversight officers coming from the United Nations. What they're going to do is collaborate in a sense to make the world a better place for these people, and marginalized identities and marginalized people are going to benefit from the systems that are going to be put into place from the new urban agenda as cities are redeveloping and developing as a whole. So basically, you have no reason to be voting for the negative today, because not only is their alternative not going to solve, but the best way for you to address climate change is on a global scale through cosmopolitan consciousness and cosmopolitan citizenship. And that is through the new urban agenda and a vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
Two minutes.
Is everyone ready? Audible? Okay, amazing. I'm gonna set my timer and then I'll get started on my next word. We open the negative case by telling you that you cannot fix the symptoms. You must cure the disease. Cities are nothing more than the symptom of the broken and diseased societies they're built in. Promoting democracy, accelerating implementation and innovation of green tech, and global enforcement of corporate sustainability fix the systemic issues underlying the symptoms that create the cities the new urban agenda wants to fix. This is why Iman and I are privileged to negate in today's round. If you don't subvert the status quo, you are doomed to recreate it. And this is what we get out of the affirmative, that they do not challenge any of the systemic issues that are preventing them from achieving sustainable development. So I would say that the main points of clash that we've seen in today's debate is first, our ideas about framework. Second, this idea about climate change being the biggest impact in the round, which I want to spend some time on. Third, this idea about democracy. And fourth, about the exclusion of marginalized people. And I'm going to tell you like line by line why you prefer the negation. So first, let's get into this framework debate and specifically how we frame this round. We want to weigh impacts of today's round on how we achieve sustainable development. What we get out of the affirmative is that the sustainable development goals are somehow incompatible with sustainable development as a priority, which we distinctly disagree because the United Nations set up the sustainable development goals. They also set up the new urban agenda. They say within the plan text of the new urban agenda that it is meant to be an accelerator of all 17 sustainable development goals. So insofar as you believe that the new urban agenda is the authority on the new urban agenda, you prefer this interpretation of sustainable development by the neg. Second, we want to say that the key word here is urgency. What should we accomplish in the next 10 to 15 years to guarantee the achievement of the sustainable development goals? We need to act now to fix the broken system so we can create the better cities the new urban agenda dreams of. If you're weighing this debate on a time frame argument, we need to achieve all these things first because we're doomed to recreate the society that we're already criticizing if we don't dismantle these key systemic issues. And if it's not urgent, it can't be a priority in today's round. Ellie tells you that the analogy of the car doesn't really make sense, but I think it's a perfect illustration of how sequentialism works. If you want to drive your car somewhere, you need to start your car. And if you want to start your car, you need to find your keys. So you can't just hop in the car and hope that's going to drive on its own. You need to find the keys, start the car, and then drive. If the new urban agenda is driving, we are finding the keys. We are starting the car. This is what Iman and I's plan gives you specifically. So that's laying the framework argument to rest. Second, let's go into climate change and how we actually provide the best mechanism for achieving climate change. So what we get out of Caitlin's last speech is that climate change should be the biggest impact of the round. We don't necessarily agree, but if you do think that you're voting on climate change today, here is how we get the best of the best implementation and mechanism for climate change. First, we create the green tech and that innovation that you need in order to have, to mitigate the climate crisis. Iman tells you in detail that we do not have all of the technology that we need in the present status quo to solve the net zero emissions equation. The net zero emissions equation is our key to subverting the challenge of climate change, but we have a very limited time frame with which to do it. So you need to prioritize implementation of green tech. And actually what's beautiful about this is that this works hand in hand with our point about enforcing corporate sustainability and a global enforcement, because we need to enforce and hold corporations accountable for their emissions. I tell you in my first speech that what we see is that corporations are disproportionately accountable for all the emissions that we have in the world, so they need to be limited. And what's great about the green tech point is that they work in tandem, because when we place an enforcement on how many emissions corporations can release, we force them to innovate for green tech within the private sector that actually flows down to the public sector as well. So not only are we prioritizing green tech as a global community, we say that the entire STEM community globally needs to come together the same way we did on vaccines in order to develop green tech as quickly as possible. We also get corporations involved by enforcing legal accountability that makes it impossible for them to so you flow to climate change. If you believe climate change is the biggest issue, we actually provide the best mechanism for achieving climate change, because we're going to create the green tech that needs to be implemented in order to solve the net zero equation, which is how we solve for climate change. change. Then let's go down the flow of what Caitlin said. First, they say that democracy implementation is neo-colonial, and we radically disagree. First of all, we're trying to promote and maintain democracy in institutions that are already democratic. The US, the UK, France, Germany, they all say that they are democratic countries. So it's not neo-colonial to ask a democratic country to remain democratic. But what we do get out of this is that democracy implementation, ensuring there's no backsliding, we avoid the issue of rural resentment, which I think is a key part in today's round. We tell you that democratic leaders are key to implementing democratic policies that are going to be environmentally friendly, that are going to be sustainable. If you have more Donald Trumps getting elected, more Brexit, as we saw in the French election just last week, that we almost had Marine Le Pen who wanted a Frexit next. If we have more of these leaders, we're going to have less action on environmental sustainability, on environmentally friendly policies. Yet they piss off rural people, and we don't access any of these benefits. So even if you take them at their best, they don't solve the climate change issue as well as we do. They make democratic breakdown worse, which means we have less democratic leaders who are less willing to implement the new urban agenda and all of its tenets. And then by fixing the multinational corporations, we also avoid the human rights abuses that run rampant, which means that we're going to subvert it because we're enforcing human rights protections within these companies. And also, we need to talk about trade-offs. If you're trading off on sustainable development goals, that hurts the UN sustainability way more than retracting a new urban agenda. It doesn't mean we stop the new urban agenda. It means that they are not a priority, and actually hurts the sustainability, the credibility, if we focus on trade-offs and let them have consistent trade-offs. So what we see is that the negative world is the only world that actually tackles the priority of sustainable development by eliminating the obstacles in the way of making it a reality for all of us. We don't piss off rural people who vote for populist leaders, nor do we worsen sustainable development by not focusing on rural areas. And we want to ensure that we have all these amazing benefits at the same time, which is why it's been a privilege for us to negate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, friends. Give me a minute or two, and then I'll be back and give a decision. First of all, it's pretty cool that everyone participating is women. That happens almost 0% in debate. So excellent job being excellent. I thought this was a really good debate. I'm going to overall kind of give my decision, give some argument suggestions, and then just some suggestions about civic debate, because I think the line by line doesn't serve your value arguments as well as you think that they do. And that's kind of true across the board. So hopefully that can help you in the next 2 rounds. So I end up voting affirmative. The reason why is because at the end of the day, their plan has already passed a lot of barriers that the negs plan has not dealt with. So what I mean by that is, though I don't think the AF was very good on some of these arguments, I'm convinced when they argue that it is unclear how the negative will be implementing their plans of developing green tech, stopping democratic backsliding, and holding corporations to account. Would it be a totally new plan implemented by the UN? If that's what you mean by prioritization. If yes, you need to deal with the credibility argument, which they make, which says, if we go back on this plan, it'll make the UN look bad. They won't be able to act anymore. Or you need to just say the UN isn't credible, and then we need a new actor to do these things. So it seems, and on top of that, it seems like the plan is adaptable. They cite this meeting on Thursday that the negative doesn't really talk about. And I think that you just need an explanation. I think that you have like your metaphor going for you about like how the UN is built on like broken values, but I need like more specificity as to how those things are being implemented in the plan, like point to parts where so like the AF, for example, is telling me like corporations are baked in and so they will be held to account. You need to like go to the plan and tell me exactly why that's not true, or how the reliance on these corporations ends up doing that. So more specifics in that regard. So I don't disagree that there are serious issues with the UN and its policies. I think that the things that you're pointing out are true in terms of like, it's bad that they excluded LGBTQ people, for example. However, if urgency, which is your framing, is the thing that we should act on, the clearer plan with the chance of making the world better seems like a good option. So maybe it's not the best in terms of stopping climate change, but it seems to me at the end of the debate that at least has a chance. And I think that both sides had opportunities to talk about why marginalized people were not included. So for example, like I was surprised that the AF didn't say cosmopolitanism necessarily means we have to prioritize some values over others. The UN got the language of marginalized people in there, but you're right, there are a bunch of countries that hate LGBTQ people and they were not going to sign on to this. But if climate change is an imminent threat, then we're willing to say that it's worth it. And then the negative could say, we're not. That's why the UN is broken, it's bankrupt. We shouldn't do it. Or we should get rid of some nations. Like cosmopolitanism is bad, I think is also a fine argument that could be made there. So that's kind of where I ended up in the debate. I think in general, you all are excellent line by line debaters, but I think it would help you, and I think that Delphine did this the best, but just kind of generalize your arguments to have a few main points rather than just like rattling off a bunch of arguments. I would also encourage you to think about what kind of new information can your second speakers bring in. So for example, Aman brought in or more emphasized the LGBTQ stuff. Blow that up, spend some time on it. A lot of the debate I feel like was rehashing similar arguments, but they should be moving along. And sometimes that's just done better when you have a reorganization structure. So this, first I'm going to kind of talk about kind of what Delphine did, the issues with democracy. Then I'm going to deal with the issues of climate change. And then I'm going to deal with blah, blah, blah. So that way I have some sort of framework and it's not just like a kind of rattling off. I think in general, there was like too much talk about how much time was left in cross-ex. You all love that. Ask a question, get some answers, but just have those top questions or your priority questions at the top and know that inevitably they're going to take time. I think that sometimes you can tell when it's taking too much time, but I think in general, it's more important to have like thorough answers and engagement than it is to get through all your questions, which just means you need to prioritize which questions go first. Other than that, I'm happy to answer questions.